Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today we actually have a little bit of a unique video because we're actually going to be in Prusa Slicer. Again, not very typical of me, but I actually have a number of classmates in the department that I'm working in as a master's student in the first year and second year that are learning how to use 3D printers, and I figured this would be a good opportunity to help them out with some of the settings and features that I typically use when setting up a Prusa printer. I personally have a Prusa Mini, though all the settings are pretty much going to be the same for the Prusa i3 that the campus has. So with the layout, first and foremost, it might be a little different from your computer because I use Windows and many people use Apple. If you're using an Apple, these 4 tabs are most likely just going to be right here in the middle. You have your build tray right in the middle. Right now I have 4 different files. These are actually buildings that I'm printing for another project. Something to note, these are 4 different files. It is very important that you are saving your files as separate bodies, not as one whole file put together. This is because it makes it very difficult to move each individual part if you've brought them in. In fact, you can't do it at all. If you bring them in independently, you have that ability to move them around, rotate, scale, all that fun stuff. So on your left, you have this toolbar right here. So the first is move, scale, and rotate. I don't really use the move feature just because, again, you can click on a part and move it around. Scaling. Also, I typically don't use this feature on the left. I usually will use the scaling on the right, which is a lot more accurate, and you can put in the very specific percentages you want to be scaling. Rotate, I do use quite frequently, and just typical arrows. You also can track them on 5 degrees if you go on this little measuring area. And then one that I use all the time is place on face, and I'll show you one of the ways that 2 different ways I use it. First, you click on place on face, and it gives you some suggestions of which faces you may or may not want to use for the bottom face. And so whatever face you're clicking is going to create as the bottom of the print. Now, what I have done here is, let's just click on this piece right here, which is actually supposed to be the top of the print. You can see the bottom of these buildings are not flat, which is very intentional for the purpose of my project. But the problem is then I want to make sure these tops are flat, so when they're printing, they have a nice clean surface. Easiest way to achieve that is to make your top the bottom, and then you just rotate it 180 degrees. And there you have it. I'm also going to rotate it to square it up a little again. So that way I make sure that all these surfaces right here are going to be perfectly flat when they're printed, but then on the bottom I still get those asymmetric bases that I'm going to be needing. Some other features you can also split or cut your piece just right here. You can keep the upper, the lower, or both, which is really nice, especially if you're doing a really large print and it's not going to fit on your printer. For me, with a Prusa Mini, very useful feature. Next thing that's extremely useful is you have your paint on supports. So when it's generating the support, typically it's going to cover a lot of all of the overhangs. But let's just say for a moment you want these overhangs to be left unsupported. You can click on this feature right here, and you can already see that I've kind of blotched that out. So let's just remove all selections and see how you'd use this. So with the left clicker, you can add a blue, which is actually saying I want supports here. You're adding supports. And then with the right clicker, you can add red. And the red is saying do not put supports in this area. So if we were to support everything, I don't have supports on. If we were to support everything, you can see everywhere has been supported where it typically would be, except for this area right here, because we have that blocked. So once you get out of this, everything else shows back up. And if you didn't notice, you can go back and forth between the editing view and the preview. So that's a really, really helpful tool there. The toolbar on the top, I don't really use very much. You do have this feature right here, which is kind of an automatic arrange. I, again, don't typically use that just because I have in mind exactly what I want and how I want something laid out. But if you have something very simple, I don't know, let's just say chess pieces, this might be a really simple way to just organize everything quickly. Okay, on the right, you have the print settings. This is extremely important if you're wanting to speed up your print time. So we drop this down and you can see there are a number of different options with little measurements. These measurements are actually how thick each layer is going to be in the z-axis as it's building up your part. Typically 0.15 millimeters is the standard for most printers. My printer can go up to a 0.25 millimeter. If you're using a Prusa 3i, it's going to be going up to 0.3. Again, this is with a 0.4 nozzle, which is your standard nozzle. Yeah. What you need to know though is if you click on draft, you're going to be saving a lot of time. Actually, let's just do let's do quality 0.15, and we'll slice it, and I'll show you how long it's going to take. 6 hours and 11 minutes. Okay, now let's say I change it to the 0.25. We're going to transfer all of the features. It's cutting it down to 3 hours 52 minutes. So very, very important if you're just doing test prints and sometimes even final prints. If you don't have a lot of details, like for example, these buildings, I'm just going to be printing them in the draft mode because there's really no details I'm going to be losing if I was to be having that Z-axis a finer detail. So that's very, very important to keep that in mind. Filament, typically I don't use anything other than PLA. I know a lot of people typically don't explore other plastics, but if you are planning on doing so, that's where you do it, is right here. The printer options. This should already be defaulted to whatever printer you typically use, but I'm going to show you something else that's really important. As you can see here, is I have a Prusa Mini Plus 0.6 nozzle. Now this is really important is if you are printing with a printer that has a larger nozzle than the typical 0.4, you want to go to add or remove printers and click add remove preset. Ignore that. And you just have to wait a little bit. It does usually take a few seconds for it to pop up. Unless I click the wrong thing. Don't install. There we go. So right now with the MK3, for example, which is the printers on my campus, everyone will have a default 0.4 millimeter nozzle already checked. If you check the 0.6 and click finish and click keep, you can now see that in your printing options, you now have the 0.6 nozzle. This is changing all of your settings, your heat, your speed to that printer with that nozzle. You have to do that if you're planning on using any printers with a larger nozzle with the 0.6 nozzle. If you don't, you will jam up the machine and just cause a lot of problems for you and everyone else. So keep that in mind if you are going to be trying to speed things up. Great thing about having this is you can go up to like a 0.4 draft, which is really going to just pump up, drop down the print time. And so for these parts, you can see it's dropping it to 2.5 hours. Really, really fast, really, really nice. You do lose some detail, but again, it's mostly in the Z-axis. I'm going to go back to my printer. Okay, now support. How support works. There are a couple of different options. I'm only going to go over two. You could say no support. If there is no overhang, go for it. I mean, there's no reason to add support if it's not necessary. But then the other is going to be everywhere. Everywhere is everywhere. It's what you see right now. And that's typically what you're going to be using for support. Again, keep in mind that you can add or take away support with that brush feature that we talked about right here. And then we have the infill. Infill is really important. I typically don't go anywhere from anywhere outside of 10 to 20%. What the infill is it's actually the interior of your print. It's what's the density. There's lots of different patterns. I typically just use whatever's the default. There are some that are faster or stronger than others, but for all intents and purposes, I just go with whatever's defaulted. Brim. Brim's a little hard to explain with this kind of support on this part, these parts. So I'm actually going to turn off the support and turn the brim on and show you what a brim is. A brim is an extension of the surface that is touching on the print bed. In this case, because I have a lot of surface that's not touching, you can see there's only these little areas right here. But the purpose of the brim is to increase your surface area to make sure that it adheres better to the bed of the plate. It's a great idea. I personally don't like it. So let's say you're printing something that is a ring, a really, really thin ring. For example, like this cap. Let's see if we can get it to focus. It has a very small edge, and what you may want to do is add a brim so it widens that and increases the surface area so it might not slide off as the first layer or first or second layer are being printed. I don't like the brim though because it's a pain cleaning up afterwards and taking it off of your print, but there is an alternative that I really do like. So I'm going to turn the support back on, turn off the brim. Now we're going to be going into the print settings. Print settings, you need to make sure you have your advanced settings turned on, and you go to support materials and go to raft, and I add usually 2 layers. Now what that's going to be doing, we're going to reslice this, and I'm going to drop all the way down to the first layer so you can actually see the raft, is it is creating a raft. It's just a flat piece of plastic that then your print is going to be printed on top of. The reason I like this is because it has a really, really strong footprint, as well as make sure that any of the support and the parts themselves are well adhered to the base of your printer, the print bed. It does add a little bit of time, which is a little bit unfortunate, but if it increases the chances of it actually printing, I think it's worth that extra time. Beyond that, that is pretty much everything that I typically am going to be doing when it comes to setting up a Prusa printer with Prusa Slicer. If you have any questions or comments, I'd love to see them in the comments below. And as always, keep modeling, and I will see you guys next time.